The village sat quiet on the edge of the desert, where the wind often carried the dust of forgotten footsteps and the whispers of old stories. Among its small houses stood the weathered home of Elena, a widow in her 50s who had known more loss than comfort but carried herself with a strength that people both admired and pitied. Her house had once been alive with laughter, but now it echoed mostly with silence. The roof, made of wood and clay, had been crumbling for months, and every time it rained, water dripped through onto her kitchen floor. She had saved what little she could, but the repairs demanded more than she could afford. It was during one of those days, as the dark clouds threatened rain again, that a stranger appeared at her gate. The man was thin, his clothes torn, his hair tangled and streaked with dust. He looked hungry, his eyes sunken yet proud, as if he had carried the weight of hunger for so long that dignity was the only shield he had left. He was an Apache wanderer, known in town by whispers and cautious glances. The villagers often crossed the street when they saw him coming. To them, he was a man without a home, a man carrying scars of battles they would never understand. Elena, however, looked at him differently. Where others saw danger, she saw desperation. "Do you need something to eat?" she asked softly, her hand resting on the old wooden gate. The man hesitated, his pride fighting against his hunger. Finally, he nodded once. "I can work," he said, his voice low but steady. "If you give me food." Her eyes moved to the broken roof above her. She had been worrying about it all week. "Then maybe you can fix this," she said, pointing. "I'll give you a meal." It was a simple exchange, one born of necessity, but it was the beginning of something that no one in the village could have predicted. The man introduced himself as Dakota. With quiet strength, he climbed onto the roof and began working with his calloused hands, pulling apart the rotting beams, replacing broken tiles, and sealing the cracks with mud and straw. Elena cooked a meal of beans, tortillas, and a little meat, more than she had intended to share, but when she saw the way he ate, as if each bite restored a piece of his spirit, she couldn't bring herself to give him less. She noticed the way his hands shook slightly when he lifted the spoon, as though hunger had made his body forget steadiness. By the end of the afternoon, the rain clouds had broken, and a soft drizzle began to fall. Elena feared the roof would collapse entirely before he could finish, but Dakota worked through the rain, his body soaked, his movements tireless. When the roof held firm against the water, Elena felt a wave of relief she hadn't known in years. "You've done more than I asked," she told him, handing him a blanket to dry himself. Dakota nodded, saying nothing. For him, words had always been less important than actions. That night, as he prepared to leave, Elena noticed his limp, the way his worn shoes barely held together, and the rawness of his feet. Against her better judgment, she said, "Stay here tonight. The storm will be worse, and you have no shelter." He hesitated again, torn between mistrust and exhaustion. Finally, he accepted. Elena prepared a small bed in the corner with an old quilt, and for the first time in a long while, Dakota slept without fear of the cold night. Days turned into weeks. What began as a single act of kindness grew into a quiet companionship. Dakota repaired not just the roof but also the garden fence, the door that had hung crooked for years, and even the well that had stopped drawing water. He never asked for money, only food, and sometimes just a piece of bread was enough for him. Elena began to realize that she was no longer living in silence. The presence of another soul in her home filled the emptiness with something unspoken but deeply comforting. The villagers, however, were not so kind. Whispers spread quickly. "Why is she letting a stranger stay with her? He's an Apache, dangerous, untrustworthy." Some even warned her directly, saying she would regret her decision. But Elena ignored them. She had lived long enough to know that sometimes people feared what they did not understand. One afternoon, a young boy from the village wandered too close to the river, and the current swept him away. Screams filled the air as villagers ran along the bank, helpless, their fear louder than their courage. It was Dakota who dove into the raging water without hesitation. The river fought him, pulling at his body, slamming him against rocks, but he reached the boy and carried him back to shore, coughing and trembling. The boy's mother clutched her child in tears, while others stood frozen, their prejudice shaken by what they had just witnessed. From that day on, something changed. The villagers still whispered, but now there was respect in their voices. They had seen with their own eyes the courage of the man they had once avoided. Elena watched all of this quietly, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and gratitude. She realized that Dakota had not only repaired her roof but had also rebuilt something inside her: faith in humanity, faith that even after loss and loneliness, life could bring unexpected blessings. One evening, as the sun set behind the desert hills, Elena asked him, "Why did you come here, Dakota?" He looked at her, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "I lost my family," he said simply. "I walked because I had nowhere else to go." The pain in his words pierced her heart. She reached across the table, placing her hand gently on his. "Then maybe," she whispered, "you found a place to stay." For the first time, Dakota smiled, not the guarded smile of a man used to mistrust, but a genuine, quiet smile of someone who had been given back his place in the world. Months passed, and the seasons shifted. The roof remained strong, the garden flourished again, and Elena's home, once so silent, now rang with laughter from the children who visited to hear Dakota's stories of the desert, the stars, and the strength of the human spirit. He became not just her helper but her companion, her family. The villagers, too, began to change. They brought him small tasks, paid him fairly, and listened when he spoke. They realized he was not a stranger but a man whose dignity had survived even the harshest trials. The very man they had once judged now stood as a quiet example of resilience and kindness. And so, the story of Elena and Dakota spread beyond the village. It became a reminder that sometimes the most broken souls carry within them the power to mend not only roofs and fences but also hearts and communities. All it takes is one act of kindness, one moment of courage to look beyond fear and prejudice, and the world can be transformed. In the end, Elena often thought back to that first day, the day she had offered a meal to a hungry man in exchange for fixing her roof. She never imagined that simple decision would bring her a friend, a protector, and a family she thought she had lost forever. The roof no longer leaked, the silence no longer haunted her, and her life, once so fragile, stood strong again. And as for Dakota, the man who came with hunger in his eyes, he had discovered something far greater than food or shelter. He had found belonging, and in that belonging, he had rediscovered himself. The villagers, whenever they passed by Elena's house and saw the two of them sitting together by the fire, could no longer deny the truth. Sometimes the most surprising transformations begin with the simplest act of compassion. And so the story ends not with loneliness, but with hope, proving to all who hear it that kindness, no matter how small, can change not just one life but many.